All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for choosing to spend your valuable time with us. Today's webinar will cover getting started with wolfSSL using Visual Studio 2022, presented by wolfSSL software engineer Jim. My name is Emma, and I will be moderating the webinar. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box, and after the presentation, Jim will answer your questions. As always, our webinars are recorded and made available on our YouTube channel. If you'd like to stay updated with the latest from wolfSSL, follow us on Twitter, connect with us on LinkedIn, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to contact us via email at facts@wolfssl.com if you have any further questions. Before we dive into the technical presentation, I'd like to provide a brief overview of wolfSSL. Today, wolfSSL secures over 2.5 billion connections. We have more than 2,500 OEM customers and dozens of resellers. wolfSSL consists of over 50 dedicated employees, primarily engineers. This progress is, of course, supported by a strong partner network that we are very proud of. Since the beginning, our engineering team has developed several embedded security products, including WolfCrypt with DO178 support, a FIPS 140-3 certification, and a FIPS-ready offering, MQTT up to the v5 specification, SSH-v2, TPM 2.0, a secure bootloader known as WolfBoot, Java wrappers and JSSC support, and commercial support for curl, and our newest product offering, WolfHSM. These offerings are accompanied by thorough maintenance and support plans up to the 24/7 level. We also offer full service consulting. Now I'd like to turn it over to Jim to discuss getting started with wolfSSL using Visual Studio in 2022.
Hi, everyone. I appreciate you attending today. As Emma mentioned, the presentation is being recorded and will be available online, so you don't need to worry about capturing any of the links that will be on the screen. So just relax and enjoy. There'll be time at the end for questions, so take some notes and ask them or enter them into chat. And so, yeah, so we're going to be talking about getting started with wolfSSL using Visual Studio. Spoiler alert, it's pretty easy to get started. We'll talk a lot more about than just getting started. So first, a little bit about me. My name's Jim. Some of you may know me by my online handle, GoJimmyPie. I've been a part-time contractor for wolfSSL for a few years now. I've been using Visual Studio professionally for the entire lifetime of the product. Before the internet was a thing, Microsoft software was distributed on floppy disks and later on CDs via MSDN. Perhaps some of you will recognize my MSDN binder I still have that holds all those installed disks. And so after a brief intro, we'll be jumping right into code examples and how to avoid some common pitfalls. Here you'll see an overview of what we'll cover. Most of our time will be spent on the third and fourth items here. And we're going to assume that if you're listening to the webinar, you're interested in learning about wolfSSL and Visual Studio. wolfSSL can, of course, be used with any editor and any operating system, but today we're going to be talking about Visual Studio. And so first, a few words about wolfSSL. You heard at the beginning a brief overview of wolfSSL. It's both the name of the company as well as the name of the core library. I'll let you read some of the details here. One of the key features of wolfSSL library is the TLS capabilities supported on super long list of operating systems. Today we'll be talking about wolfSSL. More than ever before, it's important to have open source, commercially supported encryption tools. Go ahead and skim some of the details here. If you happen to be already using OpenSL, for instance, the wolfSSL library is smaller and faster, and there's a compatibility layer to help you convert to wolfSSL. And so a lot of you folks have probably heard of the terms vertical companies and horizontal companies. A lot of vertical companies, they specify in appliances or automotive or something. And those are vertical companies. And wolfSSL is a horizontal company used across many different industries. And so pretty much everyone these days uses the internet or some network of even internally to exchange data. And the data needs to be exchanged securely. So briefly, we have a lot of partners, a lot of big companies. You probably recognize some of these logos. We have a lot of open source partners. You can see there's a tiny link at the top there for new partners being added all the time. At the beginning, Emma mentioned some of the different products that wolfSSL has. Today, we'll primarily be talking about the two icons over there on the left-hand side, wolfSSL and wolfcrypt. But you'll see how we have companion products that work with wolfSSL and wolfcrypt, the MQTT, SSH, and so on that Emma had mentioned. And there are also some wrappers that you'll see there at the bottom. You may or may not know that curl is supported by wolfSSL. So the underlying cryptography library can be wolfSSL, and we offer commercial support for it. wolfSSL it's a dual licensed. So if you want to just take OpenSSL, sorry, if you want to take an open source product such as wolfSSL for a test drive, you can use the GPLv2 license. All of the source code is available out on GitHub. The same source code that is used, Emma had mentioned the NIST certification, the same source code that's NIST certified is also available on GitHub. And if you prefer not to abide by the GPLv2 license, we have a commercial license. So if you have an internal project, you don't want to share your source code, there's something available for that too. And so, I've heard a lot of questions about licensing. And so the bottom line is nearly everyone with an open source project can take advantage of commercial grade software. More importantly, everybody can get started for free. Same NIST certified software, as I mentioned, is available for you to test drive with your project. And so you see I asked ChatGPT, like, so what exactly is GPLv2 licensing? And I'm not saying this is the definitive answer, and I'm not a licensing expert, but this is the general gist of it. I asked internally if, this basically conveys what it means to have a GPLv2 license, and you can use it, but there are some restrictions. One of the things is you need to make sure your project is GPLv2 licensed as well if you use this license. And so what are the core requirements? One of the things is there's no C++ in the wolfSSL core library. The entire library is written in C with some assembly optimizations on selected targets. There's no external dependencies. And as I mentioned, you see at the bottom there, some platforms are leveraged. If there's hardware acceleration, for instance, available, wolfcrypt will take advantage of that. And so Visual Studio, so we're going to talk about what is Visual Studio. And, surprisingly, believe it or not, there's actually some confusion I've seen more than one occasion. There's a Visual Studio code, often called VS Code. This has nothing to do with the Visual Studio 2022 that we're going to talk about today. Only similar in name. They're both from Microsoft. They have a similar name, but we're not talking about VS Code today. And you see a link down there at the bottom for the Visual Studio homepage. So Visual Studio, it's an integrated development environment. It's available in 3 different flavors. Basically, it's an editor, code analyzer, compiler. It's a debugger. It's everything all in one. It's got GitHub integration, the community version. It's completely free. So if you're concerned that, oh yeah, it's a Microsoft product and it's expensive, the community version is completely functional. So Visual Studio can be used for any project, from a tiny embedded application to a massive worldwide cloud solution. We'll talk a little bit more about embedded later, but for now, we're going to jump right into using Visual Studio using a Windows app. And so the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get yourself the wolfSSL source code. And if you prefer not to use GitHub and instead only have wolfSSL in a convenient zip file, the latest release, I can go to the wolfSSL homepage and download a zip file. But today we're going to focus on GitHub. I think the easiest way to jump right in is to download from GitHub, particularly since Visual Studio has such a tight integration with GitHub. And so you'll see there's a wolfSSL company name. So github.com/wolfSSL, and in there's a wolfSSL repository. That's the core cryptographic libraries for all the different wolfSSL products. In the root directory, you'll see there's 2 different Visual Studio projects. One is specific to VS 2022, and the other is if you're using an older version of Visual Studio, you can open the project file without the 2022 suffix. The other project, the one without the suffix, Typically, you just need to answer a few questions on how to migrate. It's a fairly old product, but we're compatible the whole way back to the very first version of Visual Studio. We have, believe it or not, yeah, we still have customers using some of the old ones. But we're going to talk about just about Visual Studio 2022 today. So here you can see on GitHub, there's a wolfcrypt test solution. So in the wolfSSL repository, there's a wolfcrypt directory and a test application. And so what you can do is you just open the VS 2022 project, the test-VS 22 project. You just open it up once you have the code locally. And so once you find that solution and you open it up, you just press step into. If you've used Visual Studio before, you press step into or press F11. Here we see the Visual Studio debugger paused at the main function. You'll also notice that there's two different projects in this solution. So there's the test VS22 that runs the wolfcrypt test. And there's another project called wolfSSL, just wolfSSL. It's the library. Yeah, it's really that easy. And so there's, as we said at the beginning, spoiler alert, it's super easy to get started. But we're going to talk about more things today because, just because you can compile and run a program, we all know that there's always a little bit more to that. And so we'll talk about some of the common pitfalls, how to set up wolfSSL, some of the fine tuning things. It's typically going to be about your requirements of what you're going to need for your project. And the best place to manage settings, particularly when managing settings between multiple different projects, such as between a desktop and embedded, is to use the user settings file. An example would be an embedded server listener and a desktop client, which we'll actually get into a little bit later. And so the wolfSSL user settings, you can think of it as the place where all the knobs and dials exist to select features and fine tune the library. If I were to pick one slide to talk about the most important thing in wolfSSL and really any application, it's the best practices for the user settings. This is something we see pretty frequently where the user settings, it isn't properly used. And so it's, as you see here, these 2 points, you should always include the settings.h before any other wolfSSL include file. That's super important. And you never include the user settings explicitly. When you include the settings.h, that pulls in the user settings file. And we'll repeat that several times throughout this presentation here, and we'll show some examples. In particular, you'll notice that the wolfSSL _user_ settings has been defined. So that's a compiler, it's a preprocessor definition. You'll see that there's another option there that since it's grayed out, we're not using the options.h here in the Visual Studio solution. We're using the user settings that's implicitly included in settings.h. The options.h, that's typically used for Linux machines. When you compile from command line in a non-Microsoft environment. Another note is you probably don't ever want to make changes to the settings.h. Like any changes you want in settings should really be done only in the user settings file. And so if you don't know how to get started with user settings file, well, we can help you there. So there's in the root of the wolfSSL repository, you'll see there's an examples directory, and inside there's a configs, and you see there's a variety of different sample user settings for different environments. So earlier we mentioned about not using the user settings, for instance, for any of the Linux, Mac, even the Windows subsystem for Linux, the WSL, I use that a lot. And you can configure the settings from the command line there. And you'll see here kind of how to get started, the -- help. And there's a link there at the bottom of the page for kind of the help on all the different command line settings. That's outside the scope of what we're talking about today because we'll be talking about just Visual Studio and using the user settings. But this is here just for reference for you. And so not recommended is I mentioned earlier about using the wolfSSL user settings as one of the preprocessor definitions to make sure that the entire wolfSSL library in your project knows that you're using the user settings file. And here's an example, something that I did, and it's marginally okay, where I forced this watchdog for the SP32, right? This is some examples of code from a CMake file where I force things on. It's probably not a good idea to do anything that's specific to wolfSSL as a preprocessor. And mainly I say that because I've gotten burned here before where I forgot that I had these preprocessor definitions someplace else, and they're not defined in my user settings. And then I'm wondering like why it's not working. And so it's really best to, everything has to do with wolfSSL, you keep in the user settings file. But if you need to, right, there's always the option to set the preprocessor definition. And when you right click on a project in Visual Studio, you go to configuration properties, C++, you go down to the preprocessor. You don't have to manually type them here, although that's kind of what's shown. If you click on the field there, there's actually a little drop down that'll come up and you can see them individually listed. And you'll see that we have not only the wolfSSL user settings, but a couple of others that we'll talk about a little later in the presentation here. So just one more example to get started. The first one we looked at was the wolfcrypt test, right? Are all the cryptographic algorithms working as desired? So what it does is given a certain input, does it provide a certain output? There's another example that I use quite a bit. It's the benchmark. So once you know everything's working properly, how fast is it? And so this is similar. You just browse to the wolfcrypt benchmark directory. You'll see that I have the benchmark-VS 2022 project. You just open it up the same way and just run it. So another library option, if you don't want to deal with GitHub and you don't want to download any zip file, you want something that's a little bit integration into Visual Studio is a little tighter. There's something called the VC PKG, the Visual C package from Microsoft. This is a great option if you don't want to fuss, like I said, right? You just want to get started. The drawback here is you won't have the ability really to make changes. If you have the GitHub project there, you can more easily have a fork of your own and make changes. The VC PKG doesn't really doing that. It's free. It's a free and open source package manager. If you've never used it, here's a link to learn more at Microsoft. It's one of the many places that wolfSSL maintains the library. And so in the root of the wolfSSL source code, there's a file called install, no extension. Just scroll down to the VC PKG section and you'll see the instructions. There's just a handful of statements that you need, and you'll see that installation is pretty straightforward. And so you just need to keep in mind that you need to run these commands from a developer prompt. And there should have been a shortcut created when Visual Studio was installed. You'll see over there on the left-hand side, the topmost icon there is the developer command prompt. And so make sure that you're running all these statements from a developer prompt. If you'd like to send metric data to Microsoft, you can leave out the optional - disable metrics. You see that when you install wolfSSL, you can actually install multiple other libraries. They're a little grayed out there in case you want to install them or not. And then, then there at the bottom, on the bottom right, you see a screen snip of my Windows Explorer. You can see that in the program files, Microsoft Visual Studio 2022, the Community Edition, that after I installed this, things ended up in the VC directory there. So if you ever kind of wonder where things are, that's where it gets installed. And so when you install the VC PKG, it should look something like this when it completes successfully. And then once it's installed, then you can just use it as any other app. And so here I'm creating an example C++ console application. There's a lot of different projects that you can install. and set up. And so you might want to type in the word console in the search box there so you can find it a little bit more easily. You see, that's what I did here. And so you just go ahead and you create the console app. And earlier we talked about the importance of the wolfSSL user settings. And so that's going to be the first thing you're going to want to do. You're going to want to right-click on your project, and under the configuration properties, CC++ preprocessor, you want to make sure that the wolfSSL underscore user underscore settings is defined. It's super important. So then you want to create your own user settings file. And so you see we have the console application one, just kind of the default name there. I didn't give it a new name. And you want to add a new item, and you're going to call it user underscore settings.h. It has to be that exact name. Earlier we talked if you don't know what to put in your user settings, I wouldn't know what to put in a user settings. I never handcraft one from scratch. So there's another place specific to Windows. You'll see in the IDE/Win directory, there's a specific user settings for Windows, and it's a great place to get started with basic functionality, kind of the most common things. And so here we have a sample application. I had mentioned earlier about the super importance of setting up the user settings right. And that slide and this slide, if I were to pick two slides that I wanted to be the primary focus of a presentation, this would be the other one, right? If you already know Visual Studio, you know your way around coding. This presentation in this slide here tells you pretty much everything you want to know. So you see at the top there, you want to make sure that the wolfSSL user settings is defined project-wide. You'll notice we're not including the user settings explicitly. The first thing we include is the settings.h file, and that's always before any of the other wolfSSL include files. They're not needed, but I included them here because they're super handy to have, because as soon as you start using, especially things over the network, you're going to encounter a variety of error codes. And the two most common places to look for error codes is in the cryptographic library, the wolfcrypt. The file's called error-crypt.h. And the other one is at the higher level, at the TLS layer. It's the error-SSL, and they're not really needed for this example, but I included them here so that you kind of see, where to find them. And so you'll see here, we initialize wolfSSL, you check for success, and then we clean up. And so it doesn't really do anything, but it's a proof of concept that shows you how to bolt on wolfSSL, how to integrate wolfSSL into your example project. And so if you bump into this error, which I actually did, I misspelled user settings. And so when I was preparing for this presentation, I ended up with this no configuration for wolfSSL detected. And well, how can that possibly be? And so, yeah, I stumbled around for a while. I had missed the underscore. So I typed in wolfSSL underscore user settings, all one word. The first time I compiled that example, it failed. I ended up bumping into this error down here. So if you don't have the user settings defined and you're not compiling from like a Linux environment like WSL or something, and you don't have one of these boards, you end up down here. And so far we've talked about C and C++ apps, but there's a good chance that if you're using Visual Studio, you've probably heard of Microsoft C language, and you're probably using it called C#. If you haven't, it's object-oriented, strongly typed. It's generally considered to be a safe programming language. And so, yeah, so wolfSSL, of course, it can be used anywhere. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about how to use it from some of the .NET languages. And so how do you do that? Well, we have, there's a wrapper, there's a C# wrapper, and you'll see that I have a clone of wolfSSL I have a fork of it, and so I called it wolfSSL-GoJimmyPy on my local directory. Inside of wolfSSL is a wrapper directory, and inside there is a C# directory. And so there's this C# core library here, and you'll see there's a variety of other examples that we'll be talking about in more detail. And so what you want to do is just go ahead and open up the You see at the bottom here, the wolfSSL C# solution file. And so when you do, you'll see the solution includes all of the different sample applications. And you'll see the one that I have highlighted here is the TLS client wrapper. And so we'll mention this a few times because it's kind of a common problem if you're just getting started. You'll notice that the C# project is highlighted here. And so it's not an application, so you can't start it. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to start this TLS client. We have the main page open up here, and I have highlighted here what I think are some of the more interesting lines of code is when you want to know what cipher suite you're using. And so here's an example of how to get what version of wolfSSL you're using, of the TLS connection, and what cipher suite you're using. I remember when we had that C# wrapper selected on the previous slide. So if you try to run it, you'll get an error like this. So it's, I don't know, it's not as intuitive. It tells you what the problem is. It doesn't tell you what you should be doing. And so I think this error could probably be improved, but it does say what the problem is. So you can't start the library. And so to fix that, you just right click on the TLS client and you set it as the startup project. And once you do, the startup project, when you press F11 or you step into your code, it'll be in bold. And so you see now the wolfSSL TLS client, it's in bold. And the only thing that we needed to add, as we saw earlier in the console example, is you just need to include wolfSSL. In this case, the name is a little bit different since it's a wrapper. And so it's a using wolfSSL.C# is the only thing that was needed for this TLS client. So I'd already had all of this installed while I was before I was preparing for this presentation. And I had used the wolfSSL library in another project. And so the first time I tried to compile for this webinar, I encountered this error. I thought it would be a good idea to include it because I like to learn from other people's mistakes. And here's a mistake, here's something that I bumped into, and one of the things that you may bump into. It probably won't happen fresh out of the box, but sometime down the road, if you did like I did, you're doing something else with wolfSSL and then you go back. And so the key here is you want to, in the wolfSSL C# wrapper, you want to make sure that wolfSSL is compiled as a DLL. And there's a build option to do that here that takes care of everything for you. And you'll see that I have here the DLL debug being selected. The other option, of course, is to compile as a .lib file. That one's a static library that you bake into your application. And so where's the build? So in the wrapper C# DLL debug is where the wolfSSL gets compiled. So yeah, just go ahead and pay attention to that in case you need to check the DLL in the future. And so the runtime errors that we saw that were still occurring. So what we're going to do is we take a look at the build configuration, and it's like, well, what's wrong with this picture? So you're compiling, right? Well, no, you want to make sure you see on this slide, there's a Win32 and an x64. And so you want to make sure that all the build options, all the platforms are consistent. And so here I went back and I changed wolfSSL and the C# wrapper and my TLS client to be all x64. And so by far the most likely problem that you're going to encounter is going to not be with wolfSSL nor with Visual Studio. By far the problems that I have most are actually making TLS connections. And so here we have an example. For your TLS client, you're going to need to have a TLS listener. And the issue with that is as computers by default are having better and better security, it's increasingly difficult for developers to get some basic things to work. And so firewalls, both hardware and the local Windows software firewall, antivirus can impact your connections to and from the computer. And so out of the box, wolfSSL tests with localhost, and I wasn't able to do that by default on my computer. you'll see that I got a TCP connection error here. And so you might think, well, okay, so I can't talk to a Windows computer. How about if we just talk to someplace like Google? And so I tried that. So under the TCP connect, I put in google.com and port 443 to talk to a web page, right? Well, that didn't work either. So you need to keep in mind that the TLS examples um, are using example certificates that wolfSSL provides for testing. And so the test certificate used in the TLS example is not meant to talk to google.com. It's meant to talk to something, probably one of your projects where you have your own root certificate. You can choose to use one of the internet's public certificates, but this example doesn't. And it doesn't tell you that. It just gives you this error -188. You see it here at the bottom, right? No signer error to confirm failure. And that's somewhat of a catch-all. It's explicit, but yeah, you need to understand that there was simply no certificate authority available for us to use here. And so if you want to learn more about Windows and certificate authorities, there's a big long link here at the bottom. And again, these will be available online. You don't need to worry about copying this down. You can send a message to support at wolfSSL or, just search for this. But Microsoft has an example that talks about certificates and trust in Windows. You can learn more about that. And so earlier we talked about WSL. I mentioned that I use that quite a bit. So here I have the wolfSSL listening server running, and you can just type in a dash question mark and see all the different options. There's more than actually fit on the screen here. The key thing about wolfSSL is all of the TLS examples, they use port 11111. So that's a port with 5 ones, and SSH, by the way, since we're talking about ports, is with all 5 twos in a row. This will be specific to your environment though, and it can often be really the most difficult part. So in order to kind of make this easier for our example today and not have to fuss with my computer, and probably something that you guys will probably have is some other listener. And so I do a lot of Espressif development, also with Visual Studio. And so what I did is I actually set up an ESP32, a little embedded device, to be a TLS listener. And so I don't have to worry about any firewalls. Typically, Windows will let outbound packets go just fine. And there, of course, are no issues with inbound packets on the ESP32. Keep in mind, if you're in a corporate environment, your mileage may vary, right? You could have a GPO policy, or certainly if you're on a different subnet, you could have issues. But generally, if you're on the same subnet, you should be able to talk to an embedded device. I'll have some more links at the end if you'd like to learn more about embedded solutions with wolfSSL and Visual Studio. And so another one of the important things to consider if you're using an embedded device is the date and time. So a lot of embedded devices don't have their own real-time clock, and certificates must have a valid start and end time. And you'll see here, I'm trying to connect to an NTP server. It gave up. The time was close. I have something for the ESP32 that'll take the git commit date and use that as kind of okay, close enough. Doesn't always work, and I did stumble over that. Oh yeah, and so I probably should mention also that wolfSSL can be configured to ignore the dates. I certainly don't recommend that. You'll probably forget and push that to production, so you don't want to relax any of the TLS connection requirements. But here we see, once I got everything worked out, I have my ESP32 listener. That's the COM port there in PuTTY that you see in the green text. So that's an ESP32 listener. And from the example C# client you see above there, so that's the output window that Visual Studio will pop up when you're running it. You'll see that the SSL version is TLS version 1.3. Remember those two lines that we highlighted earlier? and what the Cipher suite is. And the I hear you for shizzle, that's turned out to be one of the best things I always like to see. That's basically the hello world. And so that's used throughout all the wolfSSL examples, and that's usually the sign of victory when you actually have an encrypted communication working properly. And so we're going to talk about a little bit about troubleshooting. So almost all of the problems that you're going to be related are going to be for things other than your device. And so I have some tips on tools that I use for troubleshooting connections. I realize this is beyond the scope of getting started with Visual Studio, but I think it's important because these are some of the things that you'll probably run into. And so the first thing is you want to check your machine config. We talked about the Windows firewall, and you'll notice that there's we have an inbound rule here, and you can turn it on or off as needed. And I call mine just the wolfSSL port 11111. More specifically, it's a TCP port. It's an inbound TCP port, and using this port, sometimes I have multiple concurrent ports, so I actually have a second port set up here, but really you only need typically for the examples is this one. So another tool, you guys have probably heard of Wireshark. Super handy to have, essential to any network communication development. Allows you to see and decode packets on the wire. Here I unplugged my ESP32 listener. And, if you're in Visual Studio and you get a message like this, like, okay, well, what do I do with that? But here you see, this wasn't even a wolfSSL problem. So the TCP didn't connect, it retried, eventually it gave up. And then this is the error that was manifested. But, right, this had nothing to do with wolfSSL or Visual Studio. So this was my server was not connected. If it's not connected for a long time, you might not even have port 11111 traffic. And so after a little while here, you'll see my machine reaching out saying, so, like, where's this IP address that I'm trying to talk to? And I get an address resolution protocol, and our protocol packet, it shows those packets, but it doesn't know. And so we never even established the TCP connection there. And right, the TCP connection, that's long before trying to establish a secure connection over TCP. And so one of the options that's handy, it's installed with on every Windows computer, is a tool called NetStat. It has that benefit, but I don't know, it's not very fast and it's not interactive. And so the tool that I like to use is the Microsoft sysinternals TCP view is really handy. So here it's updated dynamically, it's interactive. You can see which ports are open, which are connected, you see the remote ports here. And so this too is a super handy utility to use. And so back to Wireshark, here's our exchange earlier between the C# wrapper client and the listening ESP32 server. Notice we applied the simplest filter for either the client or the server on the port we're interested in. So you'll see we reach out, there's a client, hello, a server, hello, some data's exchanged, and the connection's closed. So if you're interested in post-quantum, I had a little microblog out on social media here. The URL is kind of long. You can search for it by keywords if you're interested. But the cool thing here is it was a similar in concept. I had a WSL client talking to an ESP32 server. And in this case, I did post-quantum. So there's just a handful of macros to enable in your user settings. And you can actually do post-quantum key exchange, in this case, a key share extension on your TLS connection. And so recently, one of the guys at wolfSSL, Anthony, he gave a post-quantum presentation. So if you're interested in that, be sure to go check out the YouTube channel. It's a pretty cool presentation. He did a really good job. And the post-quantum technology, it's becoming increasingly important. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about other resources, some of the extensions I use in Visual Studio, some blogs and videos and other tips as we get close to wrapping up here. One of the things we talked about VS Code earlier, and so wolfSSL does work with VS Code, and you could use Visual Studio to edit platform IO code and compile from command line. One of the extensions that I use a lot for Visual Studio is this file explorer. It's really pretty cool. And so you saw earlier when we had the TLS client example, when you open that project, that's usually the root of the solution in Visual Studio. And what this does is it allows you to actually browse the entire GitHub repository in a separate container above your project. So you can see the entire GitHub repository in addition to your own project. And so it's super cool. Earlier we talked about navigating and using the error code header files. And so, you can see here, like without leaving Visual Studio, you could browse to wolfSSL error.ssl and wolfSSL wolfcrypt error crypt.h. And so, yeah, that's something that without that extension, you wouldn't be able to do without opening up a, Explorer window doing something manually. So another common rapid prototyping environment is Arduino. So there's a wolfSSL published Arduino library. You can learn more about that from the link shown. There's an extension for Visual Studio specifically for the Arduino IDE. So there's another extension that I use quite a bit called Visual GDB. This is the one that allows embedded development for in Visual Studio. And so I do a lot of wolfSSL for embedded specifically for the Espressif device, but you'll see here they support many different devices, right? STM32, Atmel, Nordic. So all these guys here from within Visual Studio. And one of the cool things, at least for the Espressif device, is the visual UI for configuring which device you're going to use, which version of the ESP-IDF. It's like their SDK version. You can come down here and you can search the menu config. You type in a keyword here and search for a specific setting that you want. And so that's super cool for doing embedded development with wolfSSL and in Visual Studio. And so in order to do single-step debugging, you need a JTAG board. And this TieGuard that was available was initially a crowd supply project, and it's now for sale down here. You see it 1-bit square. So I use this one all the time. It allows you to do embedded debugging Visual Studio using something like the Visual GDB extension. And here you see, here it is actually in action. So here's my wolfSSL server application. I've opened up the server tls.c. You'll see we're here in Visual Studio. Here's the COM port window that you can see some diagnostics that are on the screen. I'm paused here, all the stuff that you're familiar with and comfortable with in Visual Studio, hovering variables, inspection, the call stack, breakpoints. You can do all that from within Visual Studio. It's really super cool. So some other tips, we're going to remind you again about the importance of user settings. This was supposed to be the word compiling, which I clearly misspelled. Some registry tips, some preprocessor directives, CMake. Again, this is super important. This trips up a lot of people. Make sure you define the wolfSSL user settings, include the settings.h before any other wolfSSL include files. Earlier, we talked about compiling wolfSSL as either a DLL or a lib. And so remember I showed you a slide where you find out where your DLL is. And if you're having problems with it, there's a preprocessor definition specifically that gets defined when you select wolfSSL to be compiled as a DLL that turns on some features that makes it work well with the C# header. And if for some reason you didn't do that, but you have a wolfSSL DLL file, and you run this dump bin / exports, and this is all you see, that's what your problem is. And so what you should see is when you run that same command with the wolfSSL that's been compiled properly, is there should be nearly 1,000 different functions all iterated here, and yeah, technically with their address. But what you're looking for is something other than nothing here. So another one, this is a little out of the scope of Visual Studio, but there is a CMake and a wolfSSL root. This is just something that I have been tripped up on more than one occasion. Is this the registry cache? If for some reason you want to change your wolfSSL root value, and my embedded devices, they use CMake quite a bit, and they take advantage of this wolfSSL root, and you can manually set this to some other location. And if you change it, if you go in and from a prompt, you change it, I've seen where like the registry, like it really sticks, and until, I don't know, you log out or reboot or something, the registry cache can be pretty tenacious. So just kind of beware of that. So again, we talked about the extensions, right? So this one, in addition to the wolfSSL user settings, we got the building wolfSSL and wolfSSL DLL. Those are set automatically in Visual Studio when you select the DLL compiler option there. So the wolfSSL project is a library. Can't start it up. Another reminder there. Pay attention to Visual Studio tips. Right? So I was using wolfSSL in an Android app. I did on the computer that I was using. I didn't have all of the Android components installed, and so Visual Studio will give you some hints on things that you'll need to install. And so a recap, we talked about the wolfSSL-C examples, the benchmark and test. We talked about the C# wrapper examples, specifically a TLS. Really super important is the use of wolfSSL user settings and wolfSSL DLL. We talked about the importance of user settings and settings.h and the various issues that you'll encounter with firewalls and such. And so that's a wrap for the presentation. I do have a little more information on Visual Studio and some related webinars and blogs. So there's getting started with wolfSSL and Visual Studio blog that I wrote a little while back. Earlier I had mentioned embedded devices can be programmed with Visual Studio. I have a getting started with the Espressif ESP32 video that focuses just on using Visual Studio. I also gave a presentation at Espressif DevCon 24. This one delves much more into specifically the TLS stuff. So whereas the prior one is just getting started, this one specifically talks a lot more about the TLS. I also showcased Visual Studio and wolfSSL in my repurposing ESP32 based commercial products at Hackaday in 2024. And of course, wolfSSL has a YouTube for all sorts of training videos, and including this one. This one will be recorded and available there. And so there's forum resources to either post your questions or search for things that other people might have asked. And that's it. I hope there are some questions. But that's the end of my presentation. I super appreciate you guys all attending.
Thank you, Jim. We'll hop right into the questions now. You mentioned OpenSSL. We have a large, complex Visual Studio project using OpenSSL, and we'd like to migrate to wolfSSL. We need to have a FIPS certified environment. How should we proceed?
Oh yeah, well, for the FIP stuff, that's a little beyond the presentation today. That's definitely something you probably just send an email to support@wolfssl.com, and they can help you with the FIP certification. It's a little bigger than we talked about today. But with regards to the OpenSSL part, yeah, there's actually an OpenSSL wrapper that makes it pretty easy to just drop in wolfSSL. There's some macro definitions that will make the migration easier from OpenSSL to wolfSSL without a big code change on your part. And there's also consulting services. So if you need any help with that, we can certainly help you with that as well.
Amazing. If the Wolf VC package is updated and I have it installed already, how does my local version get updated?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. It's a manual process. So you'll need to go and fetch the latest VCPKG and manually reinstall it. So once it's installed, it's static, so it will not automatically be updated automatically. Um,
Wonderful. If we purchase a license, does it cover all wolfSSL products? And what about support and consulting services?
Ooh, that's kind of an open-ended question. Um, it depends. Uh, Typically, licenses are tailored for each customer. Generally, I think that things are fairly granular. Typically, people will license uh, some specific part of wolfSSL for a specific project. So you'll hear the term OE a lot, so an operating environment, and typically wolfSSL will be licensed for a specific OE. But really, it's best that you contact us at support or fax, as you see on the screen there, at wolfSSL.com and ask. It really depends. It depends on your project.
How do I determine which version of wolfSSL I have installed?
Oh yeah, so there's a version.h file that you can go ahead and include, and it has the version of the hard version, like the release version that's included. But if you go out to my Espressif examples, you'll see sometimes, yeah, especially if you're a developer and you're using the latest version. I have some CMake examples that use the latest Git commit, and I have some macros to show the specific, not only the main release in the version.h, but the specific commit that you're on, so that you know if you're on a main release, a stable release, or some post-release version.
Thank you. Can the C# wrapper DLL be used with other languages?
If you mean other languages, as in other Visual Studio languages, such as I don't know, F# and VB.NET, then yeah, I mean, even though it's called C#, the CLR, the Common Language Runtime, will let that be used in any other of the Microsoft .NET languages. If you're referring to other languages such as, I don't know, Java or something like that, we have different wrappers, as well as there's an entire JNI and the Java. So I hope that answers the question. Go ahead and follow up if you have a specific language you had in mind.
Perfect. Okay, last question here. Regarding the Espressif ESP32, it looks like the ESP Wolf SSL has not been updated for a long time. Do you have any status on when that might become more up to date?
Oh yeah, so the ESP wolfSSL, that's an older library that was managed by Espressif. And so now, yeah, if you go out to the wolfSSL repository, or even to the YouTube channel, and check out, I have a video on that. So there are managed components. So if you go to, yeah, I think the link is something like components.espressif.com, maybe. I don't remember it off the top of my head. Here, I can probably bring that up real quick. Um, yeah, components.espressif.com. Just search for wolfSSL, and that's the preferred mechanism for using the most recent version of wolfSSL in the embedded ESP32 environment.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jim, for hosting an informative webinar. Thank you to everyone for joining. I will email a copy of the webinar recording and PDF slides. You can keep up with our upcoming events, meet our team in person, read our blog posts, and get the latest wolfSSL updates by following us on X, connecting with us on LinkedIn, and subscribing to our YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please reach out to us at facts@wolfSSL.com. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you February 26th for how AI automated fuzzing uncovered a vulnerability in wolfSSL. Thank you all.